Now, last week, just to recap, because recaps are important, as we looked at the question that the Pharisees had, well, not the Pharisees, John's disciples were asking. But really, the Pharisees, I think, in some ways are sort of behind this because they use the Pharisees as their comparison point. Then came to the disciples of John, then came to him the disciples of John saying, "Why do we and the Pharisees fast oft, but thy disciples fast not?" And Jesus says it is not appropriate, or it is appropriate for the celebrants to celebrate while the bridegroom is present. And you'll also notice that in this verse, Jesus mentions, he says, but there's going to be a time that the bridegroom's not going to be amongst them, and then it'll be appropriate for them to weep and to fast. Of course, this is a reference, I think, to the coming rejection of Christ, especially by the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And I want to point something out about this aspect of this. We've talked a lot about the Pharisees especially, but that's because in the parables, very often, a parable is directed at the Pharisees. It's directed at the religious leaders of the day. And it's well worth pointing out that if you come to an understanding of what the conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees was all about, it really had a whole lot less to do with theological rightness or theological correctness or biblical authority or biblical law. Because the truth of the matter is the religious leaders, and mostly represented by the Pharisees, but also the Sadducees are in this as well, the Old Testament law really had very little to do with it. But what was most important was the personal power and the personal authority that the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the religious leaders of the day were able to exercise. There is something truly powerful when you are able to tell someone or have an effect on someone by just simply looking at them and going, and then walking away. And that's what the Pharisees could do. The Pharisees, by simply questioning something, are you sure this is... Now, you all know I love my mother, and I miss her dearly. But she had a few faults. And one thing Mom would do, and I'm not by any stretch of the imagination comparing her to a Pharisee. Don't misunderstand what I'm doing here. But if she really when I grew older, and she couldn't just tell me what to do, she would come to me and say something along the lines of, "Now, Russell, are you sure this is the best thing to do?" Not directly tell me. Have you? Have you? I'm sure most of us maybe have heard that from our parents. I wish what she would have done was just came out and, because often I would say, "Mom, just come out and just tell me what's going on? What's the problem? What's the issue here?" Mom did it out of love and genuine concern for me. But we do have people in our society that exercise power in a kind of way where they just sort of, I don't know that this is the best way to go about doing this. And they have the social ability to turn you into a social pariah. And that's what the Pharisees could do. This was an exercise of what's sometimes called soft power. But it's all about personality. It's all about my personal power, my personal authority, what I can do. And Jesus is pointing out it is appropriate. It's appropriate for my disciples to celebrate because the bridegroom is here. Now, drawing on that, the two next examples Jesus does, the two next parables Jesus does, he does two of them. One is an old cloth, or old clothing patched with a new cloth, and new wine put into old, the King James will say bottles, but what it actually is referencing is wine skins. And it's the Greek word there is where we actually get our word bottle, and they made a they would make out of sheep bladder or different animal bladders would hold. They go in, they scour it, and they clean it out, and there's a process that it goes through, and then the wine or whatever liquid you're putting in there can be held in that wine skin or that skin for however long. Now, Jesus is now telling them two more. Here are what's appropriate, what's meet, what's correct to do. Now, the first one is this: no man putteth a piece of new cloth into an old garment, for that which is put in to fill it up taketh from the garment, and the rent is made worse. Now, what do we have going on here? The ASV will put this: no man putteth a piece of undressed cloth. And if I can dip into some older, or not older, but a little bit of a different translation, that Greek word there is actually unshrunk cloth. So what the idea is I've got an old garment and it's got a rent in it. And then I take a brand new piece of cloth that's not been stretched or anything. It's not been worn. And I stick it on, I use that to tie it up. Some of you are shaking your heads. Now see, the art of being able to patch clothing is not, it's not, people don't do it nowadays. That's the whole point. You want it to be shrunk, and that's what they're meaning. What's happening is I put this brand new cloth, and see, our cloth now comes pre-shrunk and pre-worn and all that kind of stuff. They've done put it through the mill for us before we put it on. So when I wear my blue jeans and I wash them for the first time, they don't shrink on me. I mean, they might do a little bit, but back then that's not how that works. So what you'd have is this piece of cloth and you put it on there, and the first time it got wet, what's it going to do? It shrinks. And then what it's going to do is it's going to pull and rip at the other. It's kind of funny. My granny was a true believer in patching clothing. Like, if you ever, there's an old philosophical question that if you, John Locke's socks, y'all know that philosophical question? So John Locke darns his socks, and he darned his socks so much that eventually he had more darn than he had sock. Was it still the original John Locke sock? So you've replaced the whole sock with darning. Is it the same sock? Well, Granny would actually have pieces of clothing that, there was nothing left of the original clothes, and she'd replace it all with patches. Do you know what kind of patches Granny used? She used old clothes. She would purposely take anything that was old, she'd cut it up and make, patch about that big, and then she'd cut it down to size. But she always used old clothes. And I asked her, I said, why do you do that? Do you know what she referenced? She referenced this parable. She said, well, Jesus said, don't use new clothes to patch old stuff. I said, okay. But that's the way it is. Jesus is telling him it's not appropriate for you to do that, because what you're going to do is make the rent worse. Now, what's the application here? Well, I think once again the application is it's not appropriate to try to patch up old clothes with new. And Jesus is telling them, I've not come here to patch up the Old Testament law. I've not come here to patch up the rents and the tears that you have created in God's law. I'm not here to put on a patch on that and to sew it up and try to fix the rents and tears and problems that you're creating, Pharisee and Sadducee and religious leader of the day. That's not what I'm here for. I am here to do something entirely new and different. Although not all that different, because of course it's been prophesied about. The Jews knew that the Messiah was coming. But here's where the personal aspect of it comes into. The Pharisees and the Sadducees and the religious leaders of that day had created their own personal Messiah. Johnny Cash has a song, My Own Personal Jesus. Now, I love Johnny Cash, but I'm not overly fond of that particular song. Because there is an aspect that Jesus is personal to me. But the Jesus that saves me is the exact same one that saves Brian. It's the exact same one that saves Clyde Randolph. It's the exact same one that saves Bruce Beach. They're the same Jesus. But very often when people are talking about a personal Jesus, they're talking about a Jesus that is totally unrecognizable. Alan's Jesus might well be unrecognizable to the Jesus that I'm talking about. Well, brethren, that is not biblical. That's not correct. That's not right. Jesus is the same always. Now, I might be different, but I don't get to create a Jesus that matches my worldview, that matches what I want, what I think is right, what I think how it ought to be. There was many, many years ago, there was a group called the Jesus Seminar. And they would go through and they would identify the authentic words of Jesus. Jesus said these words, but He didn't say these. Now, they used a very complicated analytic and a way of doing it. But as you looked at it and you studied it and you took time to look at it, you realize that they had a very specific agenda. And oddly enough, the original words that they say were original, authentic to Jesus matched their agenda. Shocking, I know. Who would have thunk it? But there it was. They started with a particular agenda. They started with a particular viewpoint. They started with a particular thing that they wanted to reach. And then they discovered that Jesus, but when you were able to choose and pick what His authentic words were, He said exactly what they wanted Him to say. And that's where the Pharisees are. And Jesus is telling them, no, I'm not here to patch up or to dance at your tune. That's not what I'm here for. I'm not here to make your crooked road right. I'm here to actually follow the Word of God. And it's important to note that the fasting that the Pharisees were practicing, especially the Pharisees, was all created by them. All of the rules that they had around it were man-made. They weren't biblical in their application. They weren't biblical in their source. And I'm going to argue this. It was an attempt to increase personal power. Anytime that you have, my opinion, anytime that you have someone that uses religion to control people, and I don't mean as in trying to help someone in an honest heart with an honest attempt to help someone that you're concerned about and you're worried about and you love them. I'm talking about coercive control. The use of shame, the use of fear, the use of insult, that kind of thing, where you're using the Word of God in a corrosive and destructive way. You are causing a rent. You're tearing at something. You're destroying it. And that is all about you. It's all personal. And you are practicing, you've got your own personal Jesus at that point. And that's what the Pharisees have. And Jesus is saying, look, I'm not going to repair your old garment. I'm not going to fix it. Because here's the reality of it, Pharisee. When I do that, all that's going to happen is it's going to make the rent that much worse. Because the two things are not compatible. I've come to do something entirely new. And here we have the second part. And before we do that, and to fulfill a promise made, we're going to talk about the Bible and wine. The Bible is written in Koine-Greek. And there's a couple of interesting things about Koine-Greek that are, I'm not pronouncing that right, am I, Alan? Koine, thank you. Koine-Greek. There's a couple of interesting things about Koine-Greek. Number one, language is, in general, living. It changes. Words that mean one thing 50 years ago come to mean something entirely different. There was a time that the word gay simply means someone that was having a joyful or happy time. Now it means homosexual. I mean, the word still has its older meaning, but the newer one is sort of supplanted. We get new words. If I say Google something, what does that mean? It means look it up on the computer. Now, or on your, well, actually increasingly it means look it up on your phone, right? But I don't necessarily mean use Google specifically, although Google really hates it when that gets used like that. When you say Xerox something, right? What does that mean? I'm going to make a copy of it. Xerox will fight tooth and nail to make sure you don't use that as a generic term for copying. But that's what we mean, right? New words. Well, here's the Koine Greek. It's a dead language. It stopped. It quit. So the words are locked in. The other thing is that Koine Greek is actually incredibly diverse. It's got like very specific words. Now, you know in the Bible verse where Jesus is talking to John and he asks John, he says, "John, do you love me?" And John says, "Yes, Lord, you know I love you." Now, when you're reading that in the English, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But what John is actually saying, or what's actually being said, Jesus says, "Do you love me unconditionally?" And John says, "No, Lord, you know I like you like a friend." There's a different word for that. There's agape, and then you have phileo, which agape is the unconditional love. You got phileo, which is the brotherly love, which is Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. You've got, now I'm forgetting my things. You've got the eros, there we go, thank you. Eros, which is the love between a husband and wife. And then you've got, there's one more. It is not used in the New Testament. But it's the love of lust. Well, not the love of, it's just lust is what it means. But it's not actually found in the New Testament. Or it's not used in the New Testament. But you see, you got 4 levels of different loves. Now, we use the word love and we say, I love my wife, I love my children, I love ice cream. And we mean it's the context that makes the difference. Well, I say all that to say this. Koine Greek has a couple of different words for wine. It has a word specifically used for wine that's alcoholic. It has a word for wine that just means any kind of fruit of the grape, generic. It's got different uses of different levels of, even goes so far as to give you what level of alcoholic content you're talking about. So you have in Acts 2:38, of course, where Peter gives the first recorded sermon. And the accusation that's made is these men are drunk on new wine. Well, that's not quite correct in translation. The better translation would be, and it's a different word than ones, which is the general term used for wine. A better translation would be, they're drunk on sweet wine. And if you know anything about the fermentation process in wine, it requires something to be highly sweet. It has to have sugar in there. Because what happens is that bacteria eats up that sugar and creates the fermentation that causes wine to become increasingly alcoholic over time. Now, there is a distinction between new wine and old wine. I hinted at this last week, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about it today. New wine was not, and you get into a lot of argument back and forth, and there's a lot of back and forth. So I'm just going to tell you what I think is correct. And what I think you have is you have new wine, which is the fruit of the grape, and it's not really all that alcoholic. And then what happens is they store the wine. They don't have refrigerations. They don't have filtration. They don't have any of the stuff that we have today that we use to preserve things. And as time goes by, that wine goes from new wine to old wine. Now, the alcoholic wine that we have today runs 6%, 7%, somewhere in there. Old wine in the Old Testament, old wine that you have talked about in the olden days, in the ancient days, in old times, you're looking at anywhere between 18 to 20, maybe even more alcoholic content. And what was commonly done when you had older wine, here's what happens. Sediment goes in there. There's a concept. Now, let me point this out to you. My understanding of wine is academic as opposed to experimental. So I'm telling you stuff that I've read about. So you get what's called tannic flavor, which tannic is the acidity, the bitterness. Ancient wines became increasingly bitter over time as they became more alcoholic because you're not filtering stuff out. You're getting sediment. You're getting, the things are settling in. You've got particulates in the wine. You've also got particulates and bits and bobs from the wineskin that you've put this in as it stretches. So, what did they do? Well, you would cut wine with water. You would add maybe 1 cup, 1 to 4, so 4 parts water to 1 part wine, because the wine didn't taste very good. New wine, however, wasn't like that because it was fresh from the press. It was fresh from the grapes. And here's the reality. Something that's fresh from the grapes. Now, I'm going to assume that most people in this audience don't know all that much about fermentation, but I bet you know this. Fermentation takes time. And if it's fresh from the vine, if it's fresh from the press, if it's fresh from the grape, guess what it can't be? It's not alcoholic. So what you would do is you would put that new, freshly squeezed, fresh from the grapes, fresh from the press, into a new wineskin, with the idea being that you give it time to expand and all this other stuff. You say, but wait, Russell, wouldn't an old wineskin have already been stretched out? Well, yeah, that's the whole point. Because one of the other processes of fermentation, and I've gotten to watch this, Christy has at the house now, she's got her little bottle of Frodo. She calls it Frodo. From Lord of the Rings, Frodo Baggins, Frodo. And what it is it is her new starter dough, sourdough pet that she's got. And I call it a pet because you got to feed this thing and look after it. You got to water it and feed it. And it's grown. It has increased. It's gone from like this. It's amazing to watch. But do you know what it produces? What's it produce, Christy? Say again? Heat and yeast and bubbles, gas. Specifically, carbon dioxide. So you put it in an old wineskin, you put new wine in old wineskin, the wine begins the fermentation process, as is going to happen as you store it, can't stop it. It's going to slowly expand out. Well, that wineskin's already, so it already starts at the point of stretch, and then it bursts. And that's what Jesus is telling them here. He says, look, you don't put new wine into an old wineskin. Now, I'm here to tell you what's the new wine. And I'm going to point this out. Because of what I've said, I'm going to tell you that not always, but because the Word allows for it, I'm going to tell you that when Jesus says new wine here, He's talking about unalcoholic, pure, clean, unfermented, undiluted, unadulterated new wine. And I'm going to tell you that new wine is the New Testament. It's the gospel. I'm not putting this good news, this new message into your old wineskin. I'm not putting it into your torn, inflated, and let's face it, useless wineskin. Because it's just going to burst it. It's just going to break it. It can't contain it. It's not appropriate for me to do that. You all need to have new wine. But new wine is put into a fresh wineskin, and so both are preserved. If I put the new wine of Christ, the new wine of the gospel of Christ, into the new heart of someone that's listening, us, we're those new skins. I put that in there, what does it produce? They're both preserved. preserves the wine, it preserves the individual. Now, is that exactly what happens in the real world? No, but Jesus is making an example and producing a powerful example for them to look at. Jesus' main point here is I've come to introduce something new, not patch up or not fix the old. I've come to do something completely new. Notice when we read in 2 Corinthians 5:17, what does Paul tell the Corinthians? He says this, "Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creature." Now that word can be translated, and I actually kind of like it a little better, a new creation. Think about that. To be in Christ. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, what does that make me? It makes me something new. Now, these Pharisees had absolutely no interest in anything new. Why? And if you sit and say, oh, well, these were strongly religious people. They were very concerned about the religious health of the Jewish people. They were very concerned about following God's law, which is what contemporary writing says about them, by the way. Although I would point out that most of that contemporary writing was written by Pharisees, but we'll pass that up. Almost all of your historical accounts of the Pharisees think of them and talk about them very highly, except the Romans. And the Romans made vicious fun of them. But then the Romans made vicious fun of everybody that wasn't Roman, as did the Greeks for that matter. But all of our contemporary Jewish secular history speaks very highly of the Pharisees. They were very concerned about society. They were very concerned about the religious health of the Jewish people. They were very concerned about protecting the Jews from the evil influences of the pagan nations of Rome and Greek and all of the surrounding nations that were pushing in and trying to destroy and overthrow God's law. If you take that as true, as their motivating factor, then the rejection and the execution and conspiratorial murder of Jesus makes absolutely no sense. Because even one of their own members says, hey, if Jesus is a false prophet, it'll pass. If he's not, if he is, then we ought to follow him. When Nicodemus came to see Jesus at night, what does he say? We know you must be a prophet from God because of what you do. So if you take that, I'm going to tell you that their motivation was entirely different. And if you take this as their motivation, then their conspiratorial murder of Jesus, their willingness to compromise and work with the Sadducees, their most hated enemy, a group that had worked hand in hand with the hated Greeks and were more than happy to work with the Romans, if you take that they had a personal stake in all this, that they had personal power involved and wrapped up in all this, that what they saw was that Jesus was upsetting the apple cart. And I don't mean that as Jesus is some rabble-rouser running around overthrowing things left and right. What I'm talking about is him trying to bring back in line people to God's law. Luke gives us a powerful insight into this. And if you understand, remember this conversation, Luke 5, verse 33. And if you understand, this is a retelling. Jesus is, you don't put new cloth on an old garment. Notice. Now remember what I told you about old wine. What's old wine? It's bitter. It's got more tannic. It's got all these little nasty little particulates floating around in it. The common practice was it was kind of so that you kind of had to mix it with water, sometimes as much as 4-to-1, 4 parts water to 1 part wine, just to make it palatable, just to make it to where you could drink it, okay? That's old wine. That's what old wine was like. Notice what Luke says about it. Luke adds this little bit of a commentary that Jesus put. Notice in 5:39, no man also having drunk old wine straightway desireth new, for he saith, the old is better. It's demonstratively not better. I can look at it and go, that's got gunk in it. That's got stuff in it. It doesn't taste good. It doesn't taste sweet. It doesn't taste right. I have to like dilute it to make it even to where I can drink it. I mean, I'm going to use coffee because coffee is something that I actually have personal experience with in drinking. The first cup of coffee, who in here drinks coffee? Okay. Yeah. Oh, come on. Most of you do. Who in here loved the taste of coffee when you first drank it? Anybody? Really? Seriously? You're not making that up. But you'll notice that most of these hands went back. Did you like coffee when you first drank it, Brian? Really? Oh, man. So my first experience with coffee was I worked as a waiter, and I was about 17 years old. And you'd go. I worked at the country club there at Tansy. Those of you that might remember that, this was, good grief, 30 years ago. And I had this lady that had been waitering, and she knew everything there was to know. And we always made a fresh cup of coffee for the guest. And we weren't supposed to drink from the fresh cup of coffee because that was the expensive stuff. But what you ended up with maybe a little bit and that, and it'd been sitting there percolating. And we had what she called the black gold, is what she called it. And you would take that, and at the end of the night, you'd pour it all into one little bottle, and it, caffeinated, decaffeinated, it all went into this one little pitcher. That's what we got to drink. And you can imagine the level of bitterness that was in that coffee. And it's also where I learned to put a lot of cream in my coffee and sugar, by the way, because that was the only way to make it palatable. The first real coffee I had was many years later, because that was the only place I drank it, was when I was waitering, right? Because you had to get through that night about 1 o'clock. You get tired 1 a.m. in the morning. You get tired, worn out. So I'd have to, you'd wake up. It wasn't many years later that I had real coffee, like, fresh made coffee. I was like, wow, this tastes totally different. But the first coffee I had, I didn't like. I drank it because I had to. Had to add stuff to it. Well, here's what you've got. The Pharisees are saying, no, Lord, we're perfectly happy with this diluted, adulterated, contaminated, bitter, bits and bobs of junk floating around in it. We're perfectly happy to keep drinking this old wine out of our old, beat-up wineskin. Don't talk to us about trying something new. Don't talk to us about doing something new. We don't want to hear it. We have no desire. Now, I'll point this out to you. Jesus in Canaan, the first miracle that he performs, he turns water into wine. There's an interesting conversation that happens, and the guy that's drinking it, they start drinking, they go, wait a minute, you've saved the best wine for last. Well, what was the best wine? Is it the old wine that you got to do 4 parts water for 1 part wine, or that's bitter and awful and got stuff floating around in it? Or is it the freshest wine? The wine fresh off the presses, the wine that's fresh, and by science, not all that alcoholic. Which is the better wine? What did the ancients consider the better wine? The new wine. That's what they considered the better wine. Think about it. And Jesus is saying, you're more than willing to stay with the worst just because you don't want to try something new, just because. And why is that? Personal experience. When you see people doing things that are detrimental to them, when you see people doing things that are ultimately destructive or not all that great, and you can't figure out why they're doing it. I almost guarantee you there's some sort of personal, emotional state going on there. There's something personal to it. They have something to gain, because here's the truth of it. No one does anything without some purpose behind it. Now, sometimes that purpose is positive, sometimes that purpose is evil. Sometimes we can know what that purpose is, sometimes we can't, sometimes it makes sense, sometimes it doesn't, but people have purposes. And here Jesus is telling these Pharisees, you won't listen to me because you're perfectly fine continuing to be drunk on your own righteousness, on your own power, on your own personal aggrandizement. And let's not kid ourselves. That's what the Pharisees were about. We see that in numerous examples of where Jesus attacks the Pharisees. He accuses them of being sepulchres, whited on the outside with dead men's bones. We looked at another parable where we have the parable of the publican and the Pharisee. The Pharisee goes in, and what's his prayer? I am so glad that I'm not like this man over here, this evil publican. And what does the publican pray? Lord, forgive a sinner like myself. And Jesus asked the question, who comes out forgiven? Well, the obvious question, the obvious answer is the publican. You know why the Pharisee wasn't forgiven? Because he didn't even ask for forgiveness. That's where they are. See, Pharisee, John's disciple, who are holding out the Pharisees as an example to follow. You'll notice that, right? You notice that little bit of it, that they held them out. And the answer that Jesus is giving them, it's not, the Pharisees aren't the example you want to follow. The Pharisees, they should be celebrating because their Messiah that they have been looking for generations is here. And they should be celebrating just like my disciples are. That's what they should be doing. But what they want me to do is what they want their own personal Messiah, the one they created. And even the disciples were guilty of this. What did the disciples ask Jesus numerous times? Yeah. So now is when you're restoring the kingdom, right? Like, okay, it's now, right? Now's the point that we're throwing out the Romans and King David is being put back on and Israel's going to, it's now. Jesus is crucified. He comes back. What do they ask him? Okay, so now is the time. And then, of course, enlightenment. And they're like, oh, not how that works. Why did they think that? What in the prophecies ever made that something that was true? And if you look at them, without a particular slant, it's pretty obvious. Isaiah 53 makes it very plain that the Messiah that's coming ain't going to be like any other power that we've ever met before. Jesus himself, when Pilate asked him, he says, my kingdom is not of this world. And the Pharisees wanted it dearly to be a part of his world. Do you know why? Again, what did the disciples, what were they constantly fighting about? We see this a couple of times in the Scriptures. What were they always fighting about? Who's the greatest? Who's going to be sitting on Jesus' right hand and on his left hand? Now, why is that? Kings, ancient times, the kings, person sitting on the right hand and the left hand, when the person that was sitting in those spots, when they spoke as if they had the authority of a king. They were powerful. That was a powerful position to be in. And now let me ask you, in this new kingdom of the Messiah that the Pharisees had created for themselves, in this new kingdom where the evil Romans have been thrown out and all these pagan powers have been kicked out and overthrown, who do you think the Pharisees saw in their places? Who do you think the Pharisees saw sitting at the right hand and the left hand of this new David? Who do you think they saw there? They saw themselves. And who was Jesus telling them was going to go there? Not them. I didn't come to rule. I didn't come to make judgment. Not now. Not at this point. I'm not here to have people serve me. I'm here to serve. I don't speak my own words. I speak the words of my Father. Yes, Brian.
The Pharisees are the hypocrites in this situation. It really boils down to selfish. They were wanting to do their will and not God's. And once they saw something that was better, they tried to convince themselves that it wasn't better. And that's throughout the New Testament.
It's everywhere. The Pharisees are hypocritical. They want to do their own will. And when they see something better, they convince themselves that it's not. And what they're wanting to do is what Jesus is saying is not appropriate to do. And no smart individual would do it. What they're wanting to do is to put a new patch on an old piece of cloth. They're wanting to put new wine into an old wineskin. They're just wanting it all to just continue as it is and absorb these new teachings, to treat Jesus. And see, here's the thing. This is a pattern that you see even today. So you have a tendency of people to talk about Jesus. And again, I alluded to this, and Jesus becomes my own personal Jesus. And by which I mean not that he saves me personally, but I have what Alan's is different from mine. He's different for you than he is for me. For Alan, he's a long-haired hippie running around giving it to the man. Because that just when I look at Alan, that's what I think of. I think of long-haired hippies. For me, Jesus is a protector of conservative ideas of what's right and righteous and correct. And for Clyde Randolph, Jesus is he's another teacher that shows us another way. He's no different from Buddha or Muhammad or any of these other great religious teachers of ancient times that shared with us their wisdom about how to lead good and righteous lives. And does that match with the biblical account at all? Can you square that with the biblical account at all? But this is what the Pharisees are wanting. They're wanting to subsume, to use Jesus' teachings to their own purpose. You'll notice, if you follow it really closely, you'll see a progression. They try to win Jesus over to their side. They try to convince him to their side. You have a couple of the questions where the Pharisees ask Jesus and they say, Rabbi, right? Good Rabbi, which Jesus says, why are you calling me good? But Rabbi, they're deferential to him at first. But I think here at this parable, we see that first break where Jesus is making it painfully clear to them that's not how it's going to work. I'm not going to patch up your old garment. I'm not going to pour my new message, my new wine into your old wineskin. All that's done. It's all going to pass away. And of course, when did that happen? When did the old law pass away? When was it finished? On the cross. It's nailed to the cross. Now, next week, our last parable, and it's one of where we start to see a definitive shift in Jesus' relationship with the Pharisees and just how utterly ridiculous their attacks on Jesus become. Matthew 12:29. We have another telling of it in Mark 3:27, and we have another telling of it in Luke 11:21, and that's the parable of the strong man. That's where they accuse Jesus of throwing out devils by the power of the devil. Next week, and that'll be the last parable. Again, thank you for your time and attention, guys. I hope that I answered the question about wine to the best of my ability. I also hope that you're able to take that away and do something with it. Thank you, guys. I appreciate you.